Welcome to Cybersecurity from Scratch, Technical Foundations, Episode 5, Attack Objectives and Resource Decisions. For this episode, we're going to take a step back and look at some of the big picture considerations for what attackers are thinking when they're about to make an attack. We're going to establish some context and framing for why this sort of information is important, and then we'll dive into some of the attack types that an attacker might be considering, as well as some of the resource considerations that will inform those decisions. On the blue team side of things, we'll learn how to do some basic threat modeling and understand who threat actors might be, and then use that information to consider the resources that we apply to our defense. Before we can build a defense, we have to understand a little bit more of the motivations of both the attacker and the defender. Attackers are ultimately doing what they're doing because whatever their objective is has value to them. Sometimes that's material, it's something direct that you can put a dollar figure on, or perhaps it's something a little more immaterial, like an ideological goal or something. Either way, it's something that has a definite value to the attacker. Similarly, defenders are doing what they're doing because they have something that has value, but they also have finite resources for protecting that thing. And so when a defense is being built, you have to consider what is being defended, how much is it actually worth. We also have to remember the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For confidentiality, we primarily think in terms of data exfiltration, where we have something that we want to make sure doesn't become public. Often this is framed in terms of the macro level, like what is the big trade secret that our organization is defending, what is the R&D information that we've invested a ton of money into, basically what are the key things that we assign high value to that we want to protect. But equally important are the micro level things, items that they might be worthless on their own, they might not have some sort of market value, however they're useful for other objectives. For example, social engineers will often build very convincing facades and develop pretexting from relatively minute pieces of trivia. So often information that seems worthless is actually of great value to an attacker because it facilitates another objective. Low-value credentials and access gains can be chained together to form a bigger compromise. So even at the smaller level, pieces of information can be built up to form a larger compromise, and so they are worth protecting. Just as an idea of how you can get a good sense of what information is available on a user level and how that might be chained for something more destructive, you can do audits on what individual users have access to and what kind of credentials are cached on a local system with tools like GhostPack Seatbelt, which will show how much information can be scraped out of a user system even with non-administrative access. Ransomware is a variant on this, where the attacker isn't necessarily interested in the information itself, they're interested in extorting someone for that information. Specifically, what they'll do is demand a payment in exchange for not releasing the information. Sometimes this can be done by extracting the information and then threatening to release it if payment is not given, or by encrypting the information, sending it out, and then demanding payment or the key will be released. There's also an availability variant where files are encrypted and then left in place, and the owner is threatened with a permanent loss of access to those files until a ransom is paid. There's conflicting guidance on whether or not one should pay or not pay. Ransomware is usually triggered from nominal user access, just a user clicking on the wrong link or using one of the other malware vectors that we'll talk about in the future. And so let's consider how we can mitigate that by targeting our controls around the user access level to protect information from being locked down. For example, we can have our backups managed with a higher set of permissions than the simple user has access to. That way, even if the user is compromised, the backups will not be corrupted, and instead of paying the ransom, one can simply restore from backup. Availability attacks come in many forms and in degrees of severity. One of the oldest and one of the most easily recovered from is a denial of service attack. In this case, you have a group of machines overwhelming a system with nominal access attempts, which will bring about some sort of temporary outage. Often it's as simple as doing a restart after the attack has been terminated and the system is back online. Often this is done via a botnet, where an attacker will control a group of machines, often through malware, and then in a coordinated manner have those machines attack the system simply by issuing access requests. One form of denial of service attack is a SYN flood. In a TCP connection, recall that it's a three-way handshake. There's first a SYN message from the client to establish a connection, a SYN ACK from the server, and then finally an ACK message from the client. If the client sends a SYN message, the server has to allocate memory to keep track of who issued that SYN request until that final ACK message is received. So what can happen is the clients will just spam SYN messages into the server, and this will either, in older implementations, completely freeze up the TCP connection process, or with more modern implementations that are more robust, cause connection drops and other issues. Sometimes access to your assets is disrupted in a more durable manner. For example, in the attack on Ukraine's energy grid in 2015, the attackers used malware to enter the network and create some more persistent problems, so restoration of the whole system required recovery and rebuilding of key operating systems, and that took a lot more time. Asset destruction might be the ultimate form of availability denial. For example, in the attack on Iran's nuclear grid several years ago, malware was actually used to physically destroy some of the key pieces of infrastructure. In this case, the target was able to recover the operating systems after the fact. However, with some of the machinery destroyed, that needed to be physically replaced, and that's obviously much more complicated, and thus the entire system was brought to its knees. As more and more control systems become integrated with the internet, and as more and more things become automated, we can only expect this sort of destruction to continue, and in fact become more prevalent. Cryptojacking is a newer and often more subtle form of availability denial, which we're still getting a handle on. The general idea is that the attacker will use a victim's computer resources to mine cryptocurrency. This is where the CPU or the GPU is used to compute hash values, which are then submitted to the network. And if they guess correctly on the correct hash value, the attacker earns cryptocurrency. Now, often the victim won't even know what's happening. For example, if the malware writer has only reserved one CPU for doing the mining operations, then the rest of the system, it'll be degraded, but it might not be noticeable. And so often these attacks can continue for quite some time without the owner of the system being any the wiser. A violation of integrity in the simplest form, where data is just simply corrupted beyond recognition, really can be thought of more as a denial of availability, because the victim needs to then rebuild their database or whichever data store it is from some sort of backup. More complicated is the sort of subtle corruption of information, which isn't detected and leads to improper decisions and other negative consequences. It's hard to speak in specifics about this particular type of operation because the specific goals will vary enormously by target and what particular outcome they want from the corruption of information. One of the key things to keep in mind is that the attacker is doing what they're doing for a reason, and so they're thinking, is what I'm doing worth it? There's some material cost to what they're doing, and so the thing that they want, be it material, immaterial, has some sort of worth, and so the attacker needs to consider if what they're doing is actually worth it. So what we need to do as defenders is think about what possible benefit could they derive from what they're doing, and how can we make it so that the cost of penetrating the defenses is greater than the value of what they're getting out of the attack. We need to consider, to build a threat model, what we're protecting and what that thing might potentially be worth to someone. Based off of that, we can come up with ideas who might be attacking us and then what vectors they might utilize. Many attack vectors are simply not realistic because they aren't worth the expense of taking the thing that we're protecting. Remember, the attacker has finite resources, and they're probably using those resources in a rational manner. We don't want to assume that the attacker is acting irrationally. Insider threats are always a problem because someone on the inside could be acting against the interest of the organization. This is a universal concern. Whether it's a small independent coffee shop or an international conglomerate, there's always going to be something of value which someone on the inside might be tempted to do something malicious towards. The challenge is cultivating an environment of vigilance without introducing distrust and paranoia. Organizations need to trust, and they need to have a culture that allows people to collaborate, and compromising that can be just as devastating as the actual threat you're trying to mitigate against. A couple key things that you can do to combat this threat is applying the principle of least privilege. We're giving people the least amount of access to different systems that they need to accomplish their objectives will generally limit the damage that can be done. It's important not to put people in a position where they're tempted to act against the collective interest. Oftentimes, people aren't sitting around scheming of ways they can improve their own position at other people's expense. They just sort of see opportunities and take them. So for example, if you're a store and you're having your employees count money, it would be a really bad idea to have them just take the drawer into the back where it's all by themselves when there's no camera and they add up all the cash. That's just sort of asking for problems, right? What you really do is you have the register account all the money that goes in and all the money that comes out. There's people that are there when the money's being counted. There's usually a camera watching the entire process. And so someone would have to go way out of their way to try to circumvent those controls. So there's not really the temptation to say, this is an easy thing I can do, I'm just going to help myself here. A similar concept with IT assets, where you don't want to make it easy for someone, say a sysadmin, to just kind of turn off the logging and then they can do whatever they want. An extreme example, wire funds to somebody or something like that. You want to make it so that there's checks and balances, that people can't circumvent the security controls that keep them accountable, so that they're always thinking, I really don't want to be doing this bad thing because I'll almost certainly get caught. Obviously, you want people to have integrity, but at the same time, even people with integrity can be tempted, and so you just don't create a position where that's an issue. You can also use strict policies and procedures that remove emotion from the equation. If it's just considered part of the workplace culture that, for example, you always have two-person access to a particular resource, then it's not a question of, well, I really know Dave and I know he's cool, so I'll just let him in this time. No, there's a procedure. You always follow the procedures, and that helps mitigate the damage from an insider. I said before that generally attackers are acting in some sort of rational trade, balancing what their resources for attacking are versus what they're hoping to get out of it. However, sometimes people are just agents of chaos. Sometimes they just like starting fires and seeing what happens. Sometimes they're ideologically motivated, but sometimes they're acting out of boredom. Often, however, these attacks, while they might be irrational and while they might not be necessarily gaining the attacker anything, are executed as attacks of opportunity. They're not using some highly advanced tradecraft. They're not sitting around and waiting for years in a careful strike. These are usually fairly crudely executed attacks against soft targets. And so eliminating obvious weaknesses to make yourself not an inviting target is often sufficient to deter these actors. When we're evaluating more complicated controls, beyond simply making sure that we're not an easy target for vandals looking for an attack of opportunity, we want to look at what the resource trade the attacker is going through in deciding whether or not the thing they're trying to steal is worthwhile. Now, if this is something you can put a simple dollar amount on, or even an approximate dollar amount, then the resource trade becomes a little bit easier. Say, for example, that we're protecting some research data that took maybe 10,000 hours of a world-class scientist's time to create. That's something you can put a real dollar figure on based off of how much time the product that's being developed is worth in the market, perhaps how much you had to pay the scientist, perhaps how much the lab cost to upkeep. These things can put a real dollar figure on what the asset is worth. As an example of the sort of resource trade, in high school I worked for a small futon railer that only employed 3 people, including me, and they only did about $250,000 a year in business. Their IT budget was understandably very small. Given that this was the first years of the 21st century, there was realistically only so much damage that could be done to the business from an attack. Basically, the website could be taken down, and this would cause a transient outage. Now, given that the business was only doing $250,000 of business per year, losing access to the website, the effects were measured in the hundreds of dollars per day. Therefore, deterrence against that attack really could not be worth any more than that. When large corporations or nation states attack each other, sometimes and often the goal isn't something you can put straight dollars and cents onto. The motivations can vary enormously. Sometimes the goal is to degrade the capability of their competition. Sometimes the goal is to steal R&D, which sometimes you can put a value on that, sometimes you can't. And sometimes the goal is to just send a message and be really scary. But still, fundamentally, there is a resource trade. There's something that they want, and that has some level of value to the attacker. The tricky part, and the part where a lot of error comes in, is figuring out what the attacker wants. So it's very important to figure out who doesn't like you and what they might be willing to do to you. And from there, you can sort of figure out what kind of resources they might be willing to put into it. That's a lot of guesswork, though, unfortunately. You can't have a simple, I'm protecting something of X value, and so therefore the offender is going to put Y amount of resources into it. In addition to how much an asset is worth to an attacker, we need to consider how much it's worth to us. Quite a number of years ago, I was working in a lab that relied on a couple pieces of test equipment. The equipment still tested things just fine. It did what it needed to do. However, the operating systems underlying that hardware were badly out of date, and we simply couldn't patch them anymore. To respond to this, we put them on their own network, which was physically isolated from everything else, so you had to have access to a particular room in a particular facility in order to even get to the equipment. Now, our absolute worst case scenario with this equipment was that someone could get access to it and corrupt it in such a way that it would actually destroy the hardware, so that we would lose both the cost of the hardware and we would incur the downtime in procuring new assets and installing them on the network. Now, we were able to operate like this for a while until our security team learned of this. And then their mandated solution was that we incur the downtime to take the entire lab offline and then incur the cost of completely rebuilding it. Now, we managed to explain to them that their remediation strategy was just as bad as our absolute worst case scenario for the event of a compromise. And so ultimately, we were able to continue with a risk posture that made a little bit more sense with the resources involved. The key idea is that you want to allocate defensive resources in a way that's proportional to the value of the thing being protected. It's possible to, in the name of security, take a strategy that costs you far more than an attack actually would. For example, if you're spending $10,000 on a safe that protects a $2,000 asset, that's just silly. Then you've spent 5 times as much on the protection of an asset than you would lose if the asset was compromised. And so we really want to take that similar stance with our digital assets as well. Even if you can't put a precise dollar figure on it, it's important to keep in mind that proportionality. In the next episode, we're going to dive back into the technicals and look at exploit DB. From the red team side of things, we're going to look at the process of finding and deploying exploits, and then on the blue team side, we're going to evaluate the risk of those exploits.